Right. So,
hello, Professor. Thank you, Professor Tariq Modood, for joining me in this conversation about the essay that you have written for the journal Civic Sociology, which is focusing in this special issue on normative sociology. And your piece, which I would like to discuss with you today, if it's fine with you, is on normative sociology and the Bristol School of Multiculturalism.
Yeah, well, I'm very pleased to be part of your special issue in Civic Sociology, Elisabeth, and very happy to have this conversation.
Thank you. So I would want to begin, for those who are interested in normative sociology, which has many kind of shades and variations, I would love to hear a little bit about your specific approach to what this is. So many ideas have been put forth in recent years, but what is the approach that you have and how have you come to it?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that has been developing in sociology for quite a long time, actually, a few decades, is that scholars, researchers have what you might call committed or engaged positions. I think actually this used to be the case even before in relation specifically to class perspectives, but it's become more kind of explicit with the rise of feminist approaches, various kinds of anti-racism and sexualities and so on. Having said that, very few people use the term normative, in sociology, to describe what they're doing or to think through whether there's a particular kind of sociology that has that character. So I started using the term very, very recently. I think the first time I used it was in a lecture I gave to the British Academy in March 2018. So when I was writing that lecture and thinking about, I want to offer a characterization of my view, the specific lecture was about Islamophobia, but I wanted to kind of say, what was my kind of method, or if you like, philosophical angle in the field? I did a Google Scholar and a Google search using the two words normative sociology, and nothing really came up. Since then, I've seen that, there are some people, there's a special issue in an American journal, for instance, where normative sociology is being explicitly named and discussed. But most of the people I referred to a moment ago, like, feminist sociology, critical race theory, and so on, they don't talk about themselves as being normative. I think that's a shame for two reasons. Firstly, they quite clearly are normative, whether they say they are not, or they are or they're not. And secondly, by not saying that they are, but saying they're doing something else, it means that they don't fully elaborate their normative position and therefore properly examine and justify it. They end up therefore taking it for granted, and they become more, their critical engagement is more with, as it were, people they disagree with or social phenomena they want to critique. And while that's obviously necessary and part of any perspective, I think self-criticism is also a very important part of the academic enterprise.
Yeah.
And if you don't use a term like normative, then you don't ask yourself, well, what is it that I'm committed to? What is it I'm presupposing? Okay, some form of equality, let's say gender equality or racial equality, but what does that mean? How would I justify that relative to a number of other approaches? And that's exactly what people in normative political theory do. So I think that we need to connect with the forms of reasoning, of argument construction, as well as, if you like, deconstruction, critical arguments that take apart various positions in normative political theory. And so that's because my own work combines those two disciplines, sociology and political theory. I thought, well, maybe I'll call this normative sociology. I could call it other things, and I think in the past I might have called it contextualized political theory, because then the context refers to what you might call the sociological, empirical dimension, the fact that I'm talking about a particular country or a particular group or a particular phenomenon. And the political theory referring to the normative engagement with that phenomena. But on this occasion, I said, yeah, I would like to flag up the term normative sociology. And so while I agree with you that we now do have, at least one or two generations of people who are doing normative sociology with a small n, very few embrace the term. Perhaps I would say many aren't even familiar with the term, to be quite honest. And the term that's most often used to describe these kinds of approaches is critical. People say they're doing critical feminist sociology, they're doing critical security studies, critical religious sociology or religious studies, and so on. And I think the kind of criticality that I aspire to myself and would like to see others aspire to it, so we aspire to it together as a community, is what I might call Socratic. So Socrates was very critical of other people. As we all know, he drove people mad by asking them lots of questions till they got very angry and usually stomped off, because he'd say, oh, that's interesting, you say this is justice, but here, listen to what I've got to say and you'll see that your argument falls apart. But at the same time, he was very self-critical. He didn't make a distinction between criticism of society, criticism of the dominant ideas of the society, the criticism of a ruling class or a particular economic system like capitalism, and criticism in general, which included thinking critically about his own position. And so that's the criticality I would like to foster. And I think, all theorizing and all intellectual work should be around that kind of criticality. Whereas the people who self-describe themselves as critical X, like critical feminism, anti-racism, and so on, they are thinking about criticizing something else.
Yeah.
And they then kind of stand outside the field of critical to and fro.
Yeah.
And that's why I prefer the term normative, because we do have normative arguments, positions and commitments, and there's nothing wrong with that whatsoever, just the opposite. I think we need to bring them out in the open, and we need to show how they are informed by, but also inform the search for empirical data, for evidence, because you don't know what you're looking for till you have, some kind of a framework of inquiry. So I take the term normative sociology really to be aspiring to, pointing to a truly critical sociology, rather than a sociology that's critical about something else other than itself.
That's great. That's really helpful. I wonder why you think this almost stigma of normativity in this way exists in sociology, perhaps differently than in political theory or in anthropology. when I think of other disciplines that have engaged with and recognized our subjectivities, I find a resistance within the discipline often to that same type of engagement, except in very niche places or very specific institutions. But as a whole, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think there are at least two different currents of sociology that feed into this hesitancy. So firstly, we have a kind of positivist, but also Weberian current that emphasizes value neutrality, value-free social science, and says, you know, we may care about helping the poor and so on, but that's not doing science. When you're studying poverty or inequality or political economy, you aren't following your values. You're just following concepts and evidence. And I think that's obviously not a good self-description of what people do, because in order to know what you're looking for, you have to have a concept. I mean, a concept of inequality. Well, which inequalities are we going to focus on? This isn't a matter of personal preference. I mean, if someone said, oh, I'm only interested in inequality of height, and I want a big research grant to look at inequality of height. Well, obviously, there is some sociological interest in inequality of height. Of course, I can see that. And now, especially, you know, we're so interested in inequalities and stigmas around, you know, body shapes and so on. But we wouldn't say it's one of the most fundamental forms of inequality. Why?
Yeah.
Not because we are merely having preferences about other forms of inequality, but because we'd have a commitment to an understanding of equality, which made things like racial discrimination, superior/inferior gender roles, certain kinds of income differentials, or lack of opportunities, or opportunities determined by the class of one's parents and so on. We think these were fundamental, not just because we have a theory that says that they are, but because we have a certain conception, a normative conception of what equality is, because equality is a normal concept. So equality is not simply a statistical concept. So, you know, if we got 30% here and 20% here, oh, we haven't got equality. No, because we would need a concept of equality to evaluate any set of statistics to see whether the statistics are saying something important or not. So statistics about height differences would not be evaluated in the same way as statistics about differential opportunities or racial discrimination and so on. So that's why I think that it's not a good framework for social science to say we're value free, but because there is this tradition, positive stroke Weberian tradition, it makes people hesitant about talking about values, normativity, and so on. That's one major sociological perspective that leads to what we might call hesitancy about normative explicitness. The other one, in a way, relates to something I've already mentioned, because if you like, it's the alternative to the kind of Weberian positivist one, because it's the set of inquiries that self-define themselves as critical. So they say, oh, well, the problem with the positivists and the Weberians is that they end up in a kind of reproduction of existing inequalities. They kind of legitimize existing inequalities, or they only lead to reformist agendas, not systemic, radically altering ones. Well, that may or may not be true. that's of lesser interest to me in relation to what I'm saying to you. But what is the case is that they like to argue that their perspective is merely theoretical or analytical. So when I was a student, the dominant way of doing that was to rely on some version of a Marxist analysis of capitalism, some form of political economy. So people used to say, look, it's not that I'm for the working class or whatever, it's I'm doing an analysis of capitalism. And this is like, as it were, an objective economic analysis, though it's not economic in the way that positivists do it. Then later, when that fell out of favor, we have this kind of approach which perhaps owes more to people like Foucault, where we are analyzing power relations, but it's all done in an objective way without us having a view of our own. Mm. So in the field that you and I work in, what we might call Western Muslim studies and so on. I mean, one of the really dominant thinkers who's been very pioneering in many ways, Talal Asad, he has followed this kind of Foucauldian genealogical approach or critical approach, in particular in showing how what liberals kind of call secularism and celebrate it as a kind of emancipatory movement is actually in some ways quite coercive and limits people's opportunities and shapes certain subjectivities rather than just merely emancipating people. And I think he and others following him and arguments in general about the nature of religion in the modern period have made a very compelling case that secularism is not merely what we might call an emancipatory philosophy or practice or set of practices, but they exclude as well as include. They advantage some people and disadvantage others and so on. So I think, there's very good arguments for that. But people like Talal Asad don't differentiate between different kinds of secularism, say French laïcité, American, constitutional wall of separation, what we have in most of Western Europe that I think of as moderate secularism, where religion has some public state-supported recognition, but there is an enormous amount of personal freedom in relation to religion, and in general, society is fairly secular, and religion is backgrounded rather than foregrounded. Okay, so we got these three different kinds of secularism, the French, the American, and the West European. So you might think someone like Assad or anyone else might want to say not just how differently they work, but which might be better for us today, perhaps in a particular country. So it's not like one model. I certainly don't take the view, one model is best for everybody in all circumstances, but they don't. Approaches that call themselves critical, or that they're problematizing something, or they're deconstructing something, when the problematization is done or the deconstruction is done, they think the job is finished. So I'm always, at a relevant seminar and so on, I said, well, that's very good. So how do we now reconstruct something better than what you have intellectually deconstructed? Yeah. And they're just not interested. Well, I'm just a theorist. I don't speculate about, future possibilities, hypotheticals, and so on. I'm just talking about how we got here through a genealogy of various kinds of ideational transmutations and, circulation of power and so on. So I think that leads to a normative disavowal, which is not good. By my standards anyway, it's an incompleteness of argument. Because if you have a critique about something, yes, that's valuable in itself, but it's reasonable for someone to ask you, okay, following that critique, what do you think we in Britain or France or Germany or the United States, how might we change the world or particular institutions like schools or the regulation of religion? How might we change this so that it's better, so that it escapes the worst aspects that you have identified? And I think that is a very reasonable thing to ask. It's not asking the theorist for something inappropriate. But a lot of theorists just say, well, that's not for me. I just deconstruct. So if you like, I'm the opposite. I say deconstruction is half the work, construction is the other half. And I want to have a more constructive and, if you like, reformist sociology or normative sociology, rather than one that says the job is done after we've all done deconstruction. And then, we can all retire to the pub or go home.
I wonder if this makes me think of some of your more public-facing work, because I wonder if some of these tendencies to refuse to kind of prescribe or to suggest alternatives are similar to the tendencies, what you think, you can tell me if you think they're divorced completely to the tendencies to not think that sociologists should have a public-facing role and should remain kind of relegated to the academy as a somehow separate space from society. And I'm talking probably less about the French case. I think France is a bit different in this way, but at least in the American context, which I've been in, and in the German context, which I've been in, this has been the case where sociologists are largely not looking at the public and not really often solution oriented or engaging in the broader public debates. And you've done a lot of public work yourself, and I wonder what you think, how this connects to kind of this normative sociology.
Yes, Elizabeth. I mean, it is interesting, even though we think of sociology as, one discipline, how different national cultures work in relation to this question about what we might call public sociology or the public engagement of sociologists. So my understanding of the United States case is that actually you do have quite a lot of publicly engaged, very senior social science and humanities scholars, in particular historians and lawyers and political scientists, but it tends to be at a very elite level. So, some of the professors in Harvard and the JF Kennedy Research Center are people who have served in the White House or who have served on some other federal agency or are advisors and so on. And after their president loses an election, they go back to university and so on. So it does happen in the US, but it's considered basically a kind of elite personnel issue.
Yeah.
Sometimes there's a kind of revolving door between the White House and Ivy League universities. Okay, that's not the case in Britain. We don't do it like that at all. And nor do we do it like France, or at least how France used to do it. I think French, what we might call public intellectualism, has changed quite a lot, from the famous days of people like Sartre and so on. Even people like Foucault or Bourdieu. So you now have fewer university-based leading scholars who are kind of routinely engaged in talking to French citizens, in general, public intellectuals. You, of course, do have some, and they tend to be, some of them tend to be quite active on the media, but it's not this, they don't have the same kind of prominence or status. So in Britain, I think we've had a little bit of the kind of elite phenomenon that I said was the case in the US, though less involved with government, more involved with public communication, like, say, the BBC or national newspapers and magazines. But in the last couple of decades, we've had a radical change, which has been pushed by the government, asking academics to engage in or to show that their work has what's called impact. Mm-hmm. This is part of, national assessment. Funding depends on it for universities. An impact here means you have to show that your research made a difference to something outside academia. So it's not enough to say, oh yeah, other scholars cited my work, it's now very prominent, or Google Scholar or something. That's not enough. Impact means non-academic impact. You have to show that a government agency or the way NHS carries out certain health cures, operations, care systems, and so on, were affected by your research. And this was first resisted by British academics, especially, I would say, in the social sciences and the humanities, and perhaps also in the kind of pure sciences, the blue sky research and sciences. The other scientists didn't mind it at all, because they said, yeah, we're actually creating new technologies and so on, and industry is already using them, and it'd be even good if we had better engagement with industries and so on, and all kinds of science parks are being created and so on. But over time, because of the, as it were, the top-down force of this requirement, social scientists and humanities scholars have started to make their work have impact, to engage in some kind of public engagement. Not necessarily with policymakers, though it often is, but with groups and societies, think tanks, civil society advocacy groups, NGOs, ethnic minorities, women organizing refuge to protect abused women who need shelter, and so on. So actually now in British universities, it is very common for academics to engage. They normally engage in terms of what you might call how to do X. So they're more interested in the causal mechanisms or the drivers of a phenomenon. So if you want more people to take up COVID vaccine, then this is how you should be reaching certain kinds of hard to reach, vaccine hesitant people, like certain ethnic minorities, for instance, or certain poor communities. So most of it tends to be about, if you want to do this, then you should change a policy or change a modus operandi. So in that sense, the normativity of it is backgrounded. Of course, it's presupposed. Of course, people drawing on normative ideas, but let us say they're more likely to argue like this. Supposing they say that British Muslims are very distrustful of certain government agencies and programs, like to do with identifying radicalized populations, or those that are vulnerable to radicalization, some young people and so on. They're very distrustful, and therefore they won't work with the government and its agencies. Therefore, the program will get nowhere. So they'll say, well, actually, what you need to do then is to create some consultative bodies or some joint forms of governance and have Muslims work with you. Have the local communities that you think are vulnerable, or some members are vulnerable to radicalization, work with you. Now you could say, well, actually, that could be an argument for democracy. If it's, ruled by the people rather than the people ruled by a government agency, then of course, participation by communities that are the target of government programs seems to be a democratic desiderata. But social scientists are more likely to say, oh, we have found what works. And we can tell you that this way will work better. Or if you want to reach young people, don't talk to them about radicalization. Talk to them about, we're going to help you to meet other people so you're less isolated, to help you develop some skills so you have more confidence about speaking to people in authority, to try and empower young people so they become less vulnerable to grooming by radicalizers and other people, develop their critical skills. So most of that argument can have a normative background, but is presented in terms of, if you like, a technology, i.e. how to do something. If you want to achieve X, do it by doing A, B, and C, because the present X, Y, and whatever doesn't get you to the target. So I think in British social science now, we have quite a lot of public engagement. Most of it follows this kind of instrumental logic, and is not to be despised. We obviously need that kind of information, and it's what scientists and doctors and people like that are much more used to, and it follows the logic of their work. How to cure cancer, you do A, B, and C, because experiments have shown, trials have shown that works, rather than P, Q, and R. So yeah, I support that kind of impact-oriented social science, as long as it doesn't, as it were, de-intellectualize social science by making all of it all about kind of solutions to existing government policies or priorities. I think that would be quite wrong. So here I share, as it were, the same position as those people who say there must be space for critical sociology, for being able to criticize the government and its priorities and its way of thinking.
Yeah.
Because any policies exist within a network of policies, a web of policies, and they're informed by larger concepts and, of course, priorities. So we ought to be critical and evaluative of those. And I would say my own work has this blend. So some of it takes the form of, look, if you want to have Muslims work with the government as opposed to be alienated by the government, then do A, B, and C rather than P, Q, and R. Some of it takes that form. And some of it takes the form of, well, what is the government trying to achieve? So in general, as people who know my work know, I have a kind of multiculturalist normative framework. And so I ask myself, or I discuss, with others, is what the government trying to do, or what its critics prefer, is that consistent with the promotion of multicultural equality, multicultural inclusion? Is that empowering and bringing in alienated minorities, or is it indifferent to that? Or worse still, it's having exactly the negative effect. So, so I do both. I use normative concepts to orientate myself and my criticisms, as well as asking the questions of, well, if you want to achieve X, what is the best way of achieving it?
Great, thank you. So do you think, I'm going to now link your work, which obviously is in the foreground here, and your theoretical positionalities or way of utilizing theory to think about the social world with the Bristol School of Multiculturalism. What is unique about this school? I know a lot is unique about it, but you could tell us. And how does it bring these strands together? Because I'm thinking about it maybe as a sort of model for other places where there are attempts to do this type of sociology or social scientific work, even if they're doing it in a bit of a different context.
Yeah, so multiculturalism can mean lots of different things, as we all know. And nowadays, it's not a term that usually is used to denote anything positive, which is a shame, but it's a fact of life. And I guess I use multiculturalism in a fairly distinctive way. So the parallel would be with how we talk about liberalism. We have lots of political parties in different countries who call themselves liberal. We have one in Britain called the Liberal Democrats. Germany has a liberal party. Australia has a liberal party. In the United States, the Democrats are sometimes called liberals, both by themselves, but especially by some of their critics. And actually, all those terms can mean very different things. The Liberal Party in Australia is quite conservative.
Yeah.
The Liberal Party in Germany also is not left of center for a start, whereas liberal in the US means left of center. It means more federal government involvement in the economy and in the regulation of social life, in particular to do with standards like standards in the workplace and school standards and healthcare. And that's closer also to what it means in Britain. But academics, political theorists, often call themselves liberals and call other people as having some other position, like possibly communitarian, and so on. So liberal then, in political theory discussions, tends to have a specific meaning, and not just the same as what anyone in any country would call a liberal policy or a liberal party. So for me, multiculturalism is an outgrowth of discussions in political theory. Having said that, those discussions in political theory only started because there were certain political movements. There was some political agitation. Political movements that we often associate with the 60s, 70s, and 80s, new social movements, identities to do with equality, but not equality as sameness, extending equal citizenship and non-discrimination to include equality of difference, of acceptance of difference, not equality through assimilation. Mm-hmm. So these were, social ideas, social political ideas. And the Canadian government was the first one to say, we're going to actually do something as a policy that reflects some of these ideas and concerns, and we're going to call it multiculturalism. And actually that predated the discussions in political theory, because Pierre Trudeau's government said they were going to, they created a Multiculturalism Act in 1971. So political theory discussions really got going, at least in Anglophone political theory, in the late 1980s onwards. So we do have this kind of dialectical relationship between what multiculturalism means amongst its advocates in the world and what it means amongst those who discuss it in political theory, some of whom are advocates, some of them are critics, and some are just generally exploring it. That's a different meaning to what multiculturalism has come to have, because the critics have come to control the meaning, to dominate the meaning.
Yeah.
Critics say it's about separation, segregation, difference, not commonality. But no multiculturalist says that. I certainly don't say that. Pierre Trudeau certainly didn't say that either. So multiculturalists want difference and commonality to work together in a certain kind of respectful, egalitarian way. They don't want to work with the binary of sameness or difference. But unfortunately, perhaps because multiculturalism has not been as successful politically as it might have been, or because it's just got too many opponents, the opponents have managed to impose their own critical meaning on the term. So most people nowadays are very wary of using the term multiculturalism, even progressive politicians in Britain, let alone in some other countries, especially I would say in Northwestern Europe, for instance, well, anywhere in continental Europe. So the Bristol School of Multiculturalism also gets part of its meaning from political theory and part of its meaning from the ferment, the political agitation taking place in society, and specifically Britain, but not exclusively Britain, but that is the immediate context. So we've gone through periods of emphasizing anti-discrimination as the basis of racial equality, but then anti-discrimination, and also then adding to it anti-race hate speech, but also saying, actually, it's not enough just to be anti-something.
Yeah.
Black people have positive identities of their own. And they're the people who are saying it. They're asserting their identities. They're asserting their connection with certain histories and cultures, histories of origins, but also histories of oppression and resistance to it. So all that British experience, and then another layer on top of that was the emergence of Muslim anger against the novel The Satanic Verses by Salman Rushdie. Of course, it's not the only issue that Muslims at that time or before it or subsequently have been concerned with, but it's just such a high profile issue. And it launched a Muslim angry engagement with British society, which I think has also led to less angry, productive, constructive engagement with British society. Often movements are triggered by a crisis or a moment of conflict and anger, but that's hopefully not where they end. They mature and develop into something constructive, taking that point of criticism and wanting to change something into a more dialogical and constructive direction, working with other people in a democratic way, and working with political parties and governments and so on. And I think that's exactly what's happened to British Muslims. But taking that extra layer of Muslim identity assertion, as well as the other layers of Black identity assertion and more generally ethnic identities, and that on top of anti-discrimination and anti-hate speech. I think the Bristol School of Multiculturalism is this kind of meeting point between those British experiences that I've just described, these kind of waves of protest and political agenda setting, with the debates in political theory about what does equality mean, what priority should individual rights have over group-based claims, what does citizenship mean in a context of difference, in a context of identity assertion, and above all, what is the place of religion in public life when we are happy to make gender, race, sexualities very explicit, explicit that they belong to public life. You don't have to be in the closet about any of them. You don't have to be shy about saying, as a woman, I think X. Whereas there are some people still in Western societies that think there's something wrong with if you're saying, as a Christian,
sure,
I promote this view, or as a Muslim, I'm criticizing the government policy. So these are exactly the issues that the Bristol School of Multiculturalism has engaged with, and it's given it a distinctiveness because multiculturalism in Anglophone political theory was much more informed by Canadian and, in a different kind of way, American thinking. And this ferment, these social movements in Britain, challenged some of those ideas directly or indirectly. And we, and when I say we here, I mean, above all, the political theorist Bhikkhu Parekh, and then two people who've worked with me at Bristol and now have gone on to have eminent careers of their own, Nasser Mir, Varun Uberoi, and some younger people that that are now not yet so prominent, but hopefully they will be. We've given these political ideas this British inflection, but also have done sociological research. So it's not just a matter of engaging with the political theorists, but it's engaging with the political theorists both to give a certain character to the political theory of multiculturalism, which is also a basis for a research program, a whole series of research initiatives and probes. And the political theory is then informed by empirical research, just as it was initially informed by the political challenges that were happening in British society. So it's very sensitive to current, to contemporary developments. And Britain probably, I would say, was the first, certainly amongst one of the very first, countries that began to see Muslim identity and Muslim political assertiveness within what we might call an equalities framework, an equalities and inclusion framework. And it didn't happen overnight. I mean, I'd like to say I've been leading the way, with others, and I know that it didn't happen overnight, and it's by no means a completed task either. There are still people who say, well, how can there be racists against Muslims? They're a religious group, forgetting that one of our paradigm groups as targets of racism are the Jews, a religious group. So nobody has a problem talking about anti-Semitism as a form of racism, as a historic and contemporary form of racism. And yet a lot of people are either confused or for their own kind of political ideological reasons deny that Islamophobia can be a form of racism. So Bristol School of Multiculturalism is this kind of amalgam of ideas, political challenges in British society, sociological research, but directed by taking a certain kind of, I suppose you could call it a kind of communitarian position within Anglophone political theory debates about multiculturalism, and emphasizing that secularism should be religion friendly and not, as some people think, religion exclusive. Of course, it has to be exclusive in certain kinds of ways. We don't, we want the government to be the government, not a set of bishops preaching at us or telling us what to do. But nevertheless, we have to rethink some out-of-date ideas of secularism, or just some poorly thought out visions of secularism which actually don't fit the world we live in. Like a lot of people say, oh, why should we be talking so much about religion? Britain's a secular society. Well, yes and no. I mean, we have bishops in the House of Lords. The Church of State is the Anglican Church is the Church of State, with the Queen as both as the head of church and as the head of the Anglican Church. So I think that is really the distinctive character of the Bristol School of Multiculturalism. As you can see, it very much ties up with the earlier themes of our conversation, because it combines political theory and sociology. It is expressly normative, not at all shy about being normative, and it publicly engages with current controversies.
Great. Yeah, it seems like it's very British and rooted in the British context. But as you were talking about that, again, as someone who's kind of lived in various contexts, including Britain, I was thinking of how this could look, something similar, but different because of the different contexts, could look in other contexts as well. And I was just thinking about it a bit as a sort of model for this type of sociology that, of course, in this case is specific in one way to the British case, but in others, I think similar types of doing sociology or doing sociology and political theory together could take shape in really interesting ways, which I hope we can talk about at another time. But I wonder if you could tell us a bit, for those who don't know you and your work as well in this area, as I might being in this area of research, if you could tell me a bit about kind of your trajectory, because from what I have heard from you and other interviews with you, it's really an interesting trajectory, I think, that that bound you to all of these themes and this kind of coming together that you see, or that you just described in the British, in the, sorry, not in the British case, in the Bristol School of Multiculturalism. So maybe a bit about your sort of intellectual background and trajectory in both political theory and sociology, and your personal kind of experiences or investment in these topics as really current and pressing topics, not just for sociology, but for society.
Yeah, so you're quite right. My kind of biography is very interwoven with the themes that I was just describing a few moments ago that, you know, I was characterizing as Bristol School of Multiculturalism. And I was recently, meaning in December 2021, I was invited by my university to do a kind of autobiographical talk. It's part of a series, they're inviting a number of people. And so I decided to reflect on the first 45 years of my life, because that's the age I was when I was appointed to my present position at the University of Bristol, and then I've been in that position throughout. So I thought, rather than talk about my work, which is, if you like, more prominent because it's happened more recently and when I've been more prominent, I'll talk about how I got to that position, because it's quite a checkered history, and I won't repeat all of it here. I mean, there isn't time, but also because that autobiographical talk is available on my YouTube channel, and so people can look it up if they want to know a little bit more. So I went to school in London. I was born in Karachi, Pakistan, went to school in London, and I kind of had a middle-class home background, but this is a middle-class Pakistani background, which doesn't translate immediately into a middle-class British one. So it was it was a little odd in itself. But because I learned English quite late, so when we came to Britain at the age of 8, I didn't have English. I went to a working class school. In those days, we called them secondary modern. So that gave me a kind of cross-class experience as as I was growing up, which actually is quite rare in academia, in certainly people of my generation. And if they have it, it tends to be the other way around, that they come from a working class family background and then went to a middle class school and then obviously university onwards. But also because my school became very multi-ethnic while I was there. And by the time I left, at the age of 18, it was majority minorities. And it wasn't a simple plurality either, i.e. a number of different groups, none of which had a majority. It actually had a Black majority. So I can't remember what accurately remember the composition, but I think, it'd be fair to say that more than 50% were of West Indian or African Caribbean descent, and maybe something like 20% might have been Asian, something like that. And I was the first person to go to university from my school. At that point, the school was about 13 or 14 years old, which, is, I suppose, quite astonishing. I didn't fully appreciate that fact at the time. At university, I went to Durham University. I was very influenced by two philosophers. One is a very well-known 20th century philosopher, one of the best known 20th century philosophers, Ludwig Wittgenstein. And he took a very, what you might call, social approach to language, to meaning, to how we acquire language, but what the words mean. And therefore, when we get into philosophical puzzles, we should recognize how we learned those words, because sometimes that can help us, gives us perspective on intellectual issues. And so that kind of connection between what you might call ordinary life, like ordinary language learning, and the more intellectual side, like philosophy, that connection that he wanted to emphasize, I picked up then, and it's always stayed with me, and I think it's reflected in the earlier part of our conversation. The other philosopher I was influenced by is a political theorist called Michael Oakeshott, also 20th century. In fact, he was alive, unlike Wittgenstein. He was alive at the time I was at university and so on, and he was actually the external examiner of my master's thesis in political theory. So that was very nice for me. I didn't know him very well, but obviously met him during that occasion. And he also emphasized the importance of what you might call cultural embeddedness or tradition, how things happen because they're already a way of doing certain things, and there are already certain understandings that have been transmitted across time and generation and that are at work, but that they're also slowly changing, sometimes imperceptibly, sometimes quite disruptively, and so on. And again, I think that's influenced my understanding of ethnic minority communities, but also British society more generally.
Yeah.
And then I, wished to be a philosopher, a political theorist, and I did my PhD in philosophy. But at that point, I'm now talking about the late 1970s, in early 1980s, universities underwent a severe contraction of job opportunities. And I found myself unemployed for a number of years, and I had to look for another career. So I actually trained as a tax inspector.
Wow, okay.
Yeah. I was in the tax inspector for a year. My wife wasn't very happy with that. She said I'd married, she said I did not marry a tax inspector. Go back to the person I married. So I had one or two breaks. I finished my PhD, managed to get into some temporary lectureships in political theory, also was unemployed again, and so on. And finally ended up in equal opportunities work, but policy work. No theory, no research, just as a policy advisor and administrator in a London borough of Hillingdon. Mm-hmm. And so if you like, I learned my stuff about racial equality and multiculturalism and so on.
On the ground. On
the ground, yeah. I mean, I'd also been doing some voluntary work with community relations organization in Oxford, but it wasn't what I'd been studying. So I hadn't done any sociology whatsoever at university or at A-level even. And so I brought this political theory perspective into my policy work, which took me to the Commission for Racial Equality. And I kind of started disagreeing with a perspective that was beginning to loom quite large in Britain at that time. So now talking about the mid-1980s, which was a kind of political blackness. That all people who weren't white had something in common, and this something in common was a black identity. And I said, no, that's not true. This is a fabrication, and I don't like the politics that go with it, the politics of division, binary politics, black and white, what I called racial dualism. And so I tried to argue for a more, if you like, multi-identity perspective on racial equality. And as you can see from my choice of words, that's then kind of moving me towards a more multiculturalist perspective on British society.
Yeah.
So that's how I developed that. And then I got a very lucky break to do a very major social research survey in London at the Policy Studies Institute called the Fourth National Survey of Ethnic Minorities. It really was a very big lucky break. And the person who employed me said, well, I've read some of the things you've been writing. You've been saying why sociologists are all wrong because they don't understand ethnic minorities and so on. Okay, put your money where your mouth is. Here's your chance to test out some of your ideas. And it really was. And I knew nothing about surveys or any other thing to do with sociology, but I had very good colleagues. There was a team of us obviously working on a big survey, and they knew what they were doing about surveys. And I had some very firm ideas about ethnic identities, in particular about Asians and things that mattered to them, that British sociological perspectives, especially those that were too influenced by American ideas about black and white, were missing, including religious identities, but also people's sense of belonging to a national identity like British. And I kind of tested those out in this survey, and I'm pleased to say I was vindicated. And on the strength of that, I was able to get a professorship at Bristol University. So you can see it's a very zigzag career, both in disciplinary terms, also in terms of, unemployment, but also lucky breaks. And so I managed to combine political theory, social research or sociology, but also a public policy analysis and engagement. And when they asked me, what would you like to be called? When I got to Bristol University, you're allowed to choose a title for your chair. I thought I was being really kind of cheeky, well, even arrogant. I said, well, what about Professor of Sociology, Politics, and Public Policy? So not just double-barreled, but triple-barreled. And they said, well, actually, that's a pretty good description.
Yeah.
And I'd like to think I kind of, 25 years later, lived up to my job title.
That's a really heartening story. Also about how unexpected things that maybe at the time didn't feel like the best situations fed into this broader program that makes a lot of sense and is really integrated. And so that's a good story, I think, for a lot of young and emerging academics who have great ideas, but don't necessarily fall immediately into kind of satisfying or permanent positions.
Yeah, so I can't promise that everyone will get their lucky break, but, hang in there. It can happen that out of bad things, some good things can emerge.
And on that note, because I don't want to keep you forever, I could keep going, but I do want to ask if you have any advice to kind of emerging scholars in this area who are interested in more normative approaches, whether in a similar approach to you. I do think there are, maybe in my generation or the generation after me, which is now emerging, scholars who are really pushing this agenda and building on the work that you and some other scholars have done in our kind of subfield or field, but also more broadly in the social sciences, saying like, we want to take our positionality seriously. We want to take more normative approaches and perspectives that are already shaping our research. We want them to be more visible, and we want to be more transparent, and we want to think about not just deconstructing, but reconstructing. Do you have any advice? Do you have any thoughts about places to kind of, I don't know, communities or also just ways, any advice for these types of scholars? Because I think some who are engaged in our special issue, not even just, there are a couple of earlier career researchers writing, but also just those who have reached out to us about it and interest are in this stage of shaping their own way.
Yeah, I've thought about this, and I do have a piece of advice. So I know that I owe, if you like, my career, to the opportunity to intellectualize my lived experiences. So I have a very distinctive set of experiences, in London, growing up in London, with limited English, in a working class school with a majority of African Caribbeans, first person to go to my university, being a Muslim at the time of the Salman Rushdie affair, when there were very few Muslim voices anywhere, and if they were, they tended to take the view that religion should be kept out of view, and so on. So I know that my experiences, for instance, challenging the idea that I wasn't Black, that I was Asian and Muslim and British and so on. That came out of my experiences. And someone who didn't have my experiences couldn't have done that. Not because they weren't clever enough to do it or they hadn't read the right books. It just would not have resonated with debates and other people's positions. So my first advice is value and cultivate your distinctive experiences. Not, of course, only distinctive. I mean, experiences that are shared within a group, but within also wider society and so on. And I think in some ways I'm pushing on an open door, because this has now become quite a standard thing for your generation, and you think there's a generation behind you. Well, you look young enough to me that I can't see the generation behind you yet. But I think this is now pretty standard across sociology, especially in Britain, but also I think in the United States and other countries. So I would reinforce that, and I would say that I'm an example of someone who's done that, but I would qualify it in a way that I don't hear other people qualify it quite so prominently. So I can hear a lot of people saying, take my experience seriously, listen to me, my experience is different to yours, and so on. Even at the level of, students, undergraduates, and so on. And that's important. But by itself, it's not enough. So we need to intellectualize that experience. We need to think about how it can be researched. What are its implications for research? And even, how it can be conceptualized so that it is fit for research, that it's an object of research. How it can be conceptualized in relation to political arguments about equality, all those political theory arguments I referred to a while back. So I would say, don't just assert the importance of subjective experience, but find ways to theorize your experience so that it comes to mean something in the wider intellectual community, and of course, wider society, because, we have various political commitments as well. So, yeah, that would be my single biggest bit of advice, apart from don't give up. Things can sometimes come out of bad things, that cultivate and value that part of your experience which you don't see in sociology writing, or the scholarly work of older people, or let's say majority of society of white people, and so on. Yeah, focus on that, think about that, but the thinking part is also important.
Yeah.
It's just a matter of asserting your experience, because subjective experience can't be a veto in any kind of critical inquiry, but it can be the basis for fruitful theorizing. And that's what I've tried to do in my own work. And I would recommend that to other people too.
That's great. That's fantastic. It's been really wonderful listening to you and hearing about, even in the way that you ended, these kind of integrative ways. I kept thinking in constructive ways to think about doing sociology, doing theory. And I'm really glad that you've been able to share this with us, not just through your written piece, which I hope everyone will read in our special issue, but also into this complimentary interview today.
Thank you very much, Elisabeth. That's very nice of you to say so. I've enjoyed the interview as well, so thank you for giving me this opportunity. I'm now going to switch off the recording so other people don't have to be bothered by it. Let's see if I can do that